So great to be with you. With no more ado, this is a picture from Winter Night Shelter run by Glass Box. I hope I've got that right. Probably not, but Jo's going to correct me in a minute. And Jo manages volunteers at that. So this is very much will draw on her practical experience. What can you expect today? So we're going to do a brief overview of the framing of working with volunteers. I make no apology for that because actually I'd prefer you to avoid crises than always to have to tackle them. So we'll do a bit on avoiding them. And I'm going to look at three sections. One is on recruitment or discernment of volunteers and volunteering roles. Next one is going to be about the framework of support that helps you both avoid and deal with crises. And the last one is probably what you've come here for, which is the tackling difficulties one. For each of those sections, what we'll do is I'll share some principles and suggestions with you. Jo will give a brief example of in practice, what does it look like? And then there's time for questions, which Polly will manage. And Polly is IC timing, so she may unmute and tell me to hurry up at some point if I appear to be drifting a little bit. We've already mentioned the resources that are available on the website and that you'll get the link to there. And you can also have the slides and that recording after the session. So here we go. So what's the big picture about working with volunteers? Well, it's always about a person because a volunteer is a person. I can see at least one of my colleagues on screen who will be thinking, yeah, but we don't call them volunteers, we call them disciples or ministers or whatever. And a volunteer is just a thing for somebody who's doing a particular role and they're not being paid for it. So it's a very generic term. You may never use it in practice, but it's useful clarity. So you've got a person, you've got a role that needs doing. And you've got an organization, or in many cases, it'll be a church. And the sweet spot in order to avoid crises is to have the right person in the right role in the right organization. And hopefully then they'll be smiling and so will everybody else. So that's the big picture to bear in mind. It's not just about the person. It's not just about the role. It's not just about the organization. The best way to avoid a crisis is to have those working well together. Right. Now, church volunteering is slightly different, but we think it's useful to have a sense of the framework of volunteer management or the volunteer journey in a standard secular organization, because if you have the idea of that framework, it also helps you get things lined up. But I will also say a little bit about what's distinctive about a church context. So standard volunteer journey is you have an organization that exists with something to do, its mission or its purpose or whatever. You then identify roles that might be suitable for volunteers in that organization. You advertise for volunteers. You have a selection process, either a good one or a bad one, but you should have one. Ideally, you have an induction to get them started. You then have ongoing development and support. And then, you know, the volunteer might continue in the role that they've started. They might shift to different roles or they might move on. Lovely, tidy journey. Obviously, doesn't always work like that in practice, but that is the basic framework within which you're mentally working. What is distinctive about a church context, and it is the sort of things that tend to trigger the crises that we're all trying to avoid. So often volunteers are drawn from existing members. The language of volunteering may be completely alien, in which case don't use it. And because they're drawn from existing members, there is often not the tidy start and finish points that you get in a more secular environment. So a new role might be triggered by a sense of calling. So somebody comes up to you and says, I'd love to do X. You then have to work out how to get them started, and they're already in the organization. So it's a much messier, and it can be a more transitional start into volunteering than it is in a tidier, more secular environment. And then the really, really tricky thing in a church environment is if you've got a church member volunteering and it goes wrong, they are still a church member. And so you don't just, manage their departure and heave a huge sigh of relief, or possibly not heave a huge sigh of relief, but the mess that is created by something going wrong is still there, and that is a really big thing to be aware of to managing crises. And also, particularly when churches are involved in social action, the boundary between a volunteer, a participant, and a attender may be completely blurred for really good reasons. And you want to work with that blurring of the participation ladder, but that blurring can also trigger issues if you're not really clear about what the parameters are for somebody at any particular time. The other caveat is in a church, ideally, or in a church context or a faith-based context, we do have this language of confession and forgiveness. which should, in theory, mean that we understand that we're human, we understand that stuff goes wrong, and we understand that forgiveness is available. And so it should be easier to deal with stuff when it goes wrong. And actually, we might even be able to pray about it, which could help. If I was being honest, I would say that my observation of many churches is, instead of using that language of normalizing stuff going wrong and forgiveness being possible, what we sometimes think is, because we're church, we should be perfect, and we feel an unhelpful sense of disappointment when things go wrong. So I think building into, however you're volunteering, just a sense that it's completely normal as human beings that stuff goes wrong. And when it goes wrong, we don't need to panic. There's an insurance company, isn't there? Something like, we don't turn a drama into a crisis. And I think if we could build that in more, it would make it much easier, because then when people make a mistake or something goes wrong, there's not the blame attached to it. It's just like, oh, well, it's gone wrong. Let's sort it out and let's move on. So that's the church context. So today we're going to look at 3 areas, as I said: recruitment, discernment, including, is there anybody actually out there to volunteer, ongoing support framework, and tackling difficulties. And then my caveat always is, I'm going to give you suggestions, but I understand you're rarely starting with a blank sheet of paper. You have to be able to decide on the priorities and capacity in your context and what will work in practice and be sustainable. And just a top tip, as Jo and I were talking about this before we prepped, just to be really clear that being flexible, which is essential in volunteer management, is not the same as being unclear. And Brené Brown sometimes says clear is kind. And I think clarity is probably going to come up as a theme, that clarity is incredibly helpful. And it may seem that clarity is being inflexible. It's not, it's just being clear. So recruitment discernment. So you exist as a church or an organization, you've got stuff you want doing. You might or might not have people putting their hands up. Let's come on to that. What I find very useful, so quite often when you're wanting people to volunteer, one of the things is that you hear over and over again is there is nobody to do it. And one of the things that can go wrong in recruitment is actually a lack of people. And particularly this has come up since COVID, also people working later or longer, looking after grandchildren and things like that. And so it feels sometimes as if there aren't enough people around. And the other thing that can go wrong is that there are people around, but they don't feel like the right people. So I find it incredibly useful, if you're struggling to recruit volunteers, to remember this very simple thing, which is AIDA, if you're an operatic type. I'm not. Awareness, interest, desire, action. So we know what we're doing and we're passionately committed to it. And we can't understand why people aren't volunteering for it. But sometimes what we've overlooked is we know exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. And if we don't, we probably should work on that. But actually, other people aren't aware of it. And if they're not aware of what we do and the purpose of it, they're definitely not going to put their hand in the air for it. So awareness is incredibly important. You've also got then interest, I for interest. What's it about? How can you pique their interest? What's its purpose? Who might enjoy it? Is there information? I could be for information. Is there information about this thing? How could they get it? Do they have to read a 30-page document, or might you give them something simpler? How can you then, if you've piqued their interest with some information, translate that into a desire to get involved, and perhaps have a flexible range of ways that they could get involved, not expecting everybody to sign up for a life sentence. And then the last one is action. If they've become aware of it, interested in it, have a desire to do something, actually, what do they do next? Because if you stand up and say, talk to Jo if you want to volunteer, and they don't know who Jo is, and they've got to rush off after church or wherever it is, you've not made it easy for them to take action. Now, my experience, when there is a lack of volunteers, for all sorts of complicated reasons that feel completely overpowering, the 2 things that are most likely to go wrong in this sequence of 4 things is the awareness and the action. We fail to make people sufficiently aware of what we're doing and how inspiring it is, and therefore they might like to get involved, or we fail to make it really easy for them to actually connect with us. So I think AIDA is really useful. In the guidance, you'll find, if you go to the guidance on working well with volunteers, there's actually a section on where to find volunteers. For each of the suggestions that you might want, and we've deliberately given quite a few, there are positives and negatives in each. So I'm giving this one as an example. So if, for example, you're in a church and you put an advert in the pew sheet, the advantage of that is it's easy to do, and it also means they might take the details home with them if you've got a pew sheet. You may obviously be digital. But some people just don't read it. So you think you put it in the pew sheet, but actually people don't read it. So it's about thinking about what the pros and cons. In the guidance, when we did this originally, we had smiley faces and frowny faces to show which were positives and negatives. In the latest iteration, you'll have to work it out for yourself because they're all just bullet points, but that's a good mental exercise, hopefully. But you'll find a number of section suggestions in section 5 of the guidance. Came across this on LinkedIn recently, thought this was also really, really interesting if you're struggling with recruiting. And it's about understanding that not everybody engages in the same way, and also that their engagement might change over time. So basically, this is about thinking, okay, not everybody is going to be deeply committed and sign up to a large amount of time. So you have your core of people who might be the deeply committed, and you find roles for them that match that level of engagement. But you might also have the people who are, seem a bit more peripheral, but they are actively participating, but they don't want you to ask them to do the really core stuff, and they'll run for the hills if you try and put pressure on them to do that. And then you have some people who you might call friends who are loosely connecting, who might only dip in and out occasionally. And how can you make it possible for those people to do that without wrecking the thing that you're doing? So you don't want somebody who you might perceive as unreliable because they're a friend who's loosely connecting, doing something that relies on somebody to be a core person. But it is useful to think about how can you see where the opportunities to find those, well, they call them stewards, members and friends. It doesn't really matter what you call them, but the core, the next layer out, and then the next layer out. And then it's useful to this stuff about around the edge as well. How do you make decisions together? How do we resource ourselves? And how do we nurture that give and receive? So I think that I found that quite a useful thing, particularly where you're doing something perhaps church-based, but which is engaging with the wider community. You may have quite a few people who are friends, and they may at some point become stewards, but they may not want to start like that. And it's about whether or not you've given them the opportunity to have that light engagement that may grow into something else, or it may not. So I found that useful, thanks to Community Weaving Framework. So in terms of the role and task, actually being clear about what you're asking somebody to do and what the commitment is to it. So why should they do it? Because it makes a difference. How do they need to do it? And what are you actually asking them to do can make a big difference to actually not having a crisis. And I think I'm just going to actually go to Jo to give the example from her context.
So this is an example from the night shelter where we were in fact getting short of volunteers. We started nearly 10 years ago working with Glass Door charity, one night a week, 6 other churches on the other nights of the week. And what we were finding was we had quite a few friends in terms of that last document, people from the community volunteering, but we were losing a whole lot of our members and our stewards, the members of the church, basically because the area of London we're in has a terrifically high turnover of population. Just to give you an example, I live in a road and there are 6 houses directly opposite me that have all changed hands since COVID. So we were losing a lot of people from the church who moved on. People came in, we had got new members, and we realised that this was an AIDA situation, that actually the people who'd come into the church was no good just saying, now's the time to sign up if you want to volunteer for the night shelter this winter, because they weren't aware. So in our context, what we did was 2 weeks running, the vicar interviewed me in the service. So we had an interview in front of people so that they heard more about the night shelter. That gave them awareness. What we did then was that there was an opportunity to talk to me afterwards, and they could give an email to get more information so they could be interested without committing themselves. Don't expect people to jump straight away. They need information so that they can then discern whether that's right. So having been sent the information and the choice of things, that gave them an opportunity to take action if they wanted to. And what I found was that about half the people who'd asked for information then did take action and sign up. So that was, in fact, a useful application of the AIDA model for us. Thank you. Polly, I think it's over to you.
Yeah. So thanks, Julia and Jo. So that was our first section on recruitment and discernment. And I'm just going to open it up now for any questions that anyone might have at this point. As I said, there will be time later for us to pick up other questions that might occur to you as we go through the rest of the session. But if you have a question on recruitment or discernment based on what you've just heard, if you want to raise your actual hand or your virtual hand, or pop a question in the chat, we'll take those now. I can't see any hands at the moment. I think that was all very clear from Julia and Jo.
Okay. Let's
Clear
save
is
them up.
kind, as we heard. So I think we'll move on. But as I said, if any questions occur to you, do put them in the chat or save them for later.
Perfect. Thanks, Polly. And just to say, we've put in the slides again a link into the document with all the information, because actually these are, so scoping how you work with volunteers and clarifying tasks is great for getting the setup right. Recruiting volunteers, I've said that we've already given some ideas of where to find volunteers, but you'll have your own ideas, of course. Mutual expectations, never have a contract with a volunteer because that's far too legal and slips into employment law and all sorts of complexities, but actually being transparent about what your mutual expectations are. Recruiting volunteers checklist, some government guidance and some guidance from NCVO. So hopefully you'll find those links useful. I want to just say, in that recruitment process, when you have things like a role description, however simple, it can be really simple, and a mutual expectations document. When I worked in a secular environment, the only 2 occasions where I had to effectively sack a volunteer, those documents were the key to being able to do that, because I could say, actually, this is not how we work. Are you happy to work as we agreed in the role description and the mutual expectations? And if you can't agree to work within those boundaries, I'm afraid this is not the role for you. Very painful, even with a volunteer, but those things you do to the setup enable you to then resolve the crisis. And on both occasions, other volunteers then said, thank goodness for that. That was an absolute nightmare. So sometimes saying goodbye to somebody is helpful, although I've said in the church context, it's more complicated. Right, framework of support. So this is about, again, it's mostly about minimizing crises, and as I've just said, sort of getting somebody started well means you're less likely to lose them quickly if they feel they belong, they understand the role and the difference it makes, they understand how to do things, where to find things, who to ask. Really banal things, but make a massive difference to people, because people get incredibly anxious if they don't know what they're meant to be doing. They understand the keeping safe things that they have to do and why. So safeguarding stuff has been covered, particularly if you're dealing with vulnerable people. You're less likely to have them doing something unexpected or possibly even slightly shocking. You're more likely to hear if there's an issue. If you set up in a way that says things are going to go wrong, at some point you won't understand something, or you might get something wrong, or we might get something wrong. That is completely normal. Come and talk to me. It's incredibly helpful in reducing something that feels as if it could be a crisis into something that's manageable. And you're also less likely to lose them if they feel valued. So that framework of giving them guidance on the role, making sure there's a sense of personal connection, not thinking that practicalities are tedious, but actually they're the things that will make somebody feel confident and at home. You know, if they're going to make a cup of tea, do they have to bring their tea bag with them, for example, or do they know where the kettle is and is there decaf? You know, things that seem trivial but actually really important. Managing the formalities well, things like health and safety, and making sure they feel valued. And I just want to say on the value thing, do not do that terrible volunteer thing, management thing of saying, thank you, we value you so much, which is hideously unspecific and just sounds very patronizing. Notice what they're doing well and thank them for it specifically. That's what makes people feel valued, not the sort of generic churchy thank you, which is quite irritating. On managing formalities, there's a section on this. I just want to refer back slightly retrospectively. When Jo and I did this guidance initially, we did something which is not translated into the current document, but I would like to encourage you to think about it. So on every one of these formalities, there's a what, there's a why, and there's a how. And even if you, I think just working that out is really helpful. And health and safety is the example, because people have a tendency to say, I need to give you the health and safety guidance, I'm so sorry. But actually, if you understand that the health and safety guidance is done, why? Because it's morally right, it's legally necessary, and it's practically important in this example, then instead of apologizing for it as a problem, you're embracing it as something that is helpful and life-giving. And I think this has translated. So for each of those, then we've linked to some guidance available. So I think it's easy to play into saying, oh, the formalities are a bit of a bore and some box ticking person has made us do them. But if you can ask yourself, why does this matter? Same exactly with safeguarding. As a church, we want people to be safe. We don't want them to be at risk. So let's not apologize for it. Let's embrace it and share the values of it being important. That's a very quick one. Jo, I'm going to hand over to you for an example.
Our example really plays into that, having good guidance on role and guidance on practicalities. And working with Glassdoor, they have a wonderful thing. Because you're screen sharing, I've got it to hold up. But they've actually produced what they call 7 golden rules of volunteering, which are things like not giving out personal details to guests and not arranging outside contact. The great thing is that not only do they have those, but those are repeated, so people really take them on board. In my experience, there's no point having a 70-page handbook and getting people to say, well, all the details are there. Distill it, make that guidance on practicalities as clear as possible, and then go through it repeatedly. In Glassdoor, we go through it every week before the session, before the guests arrive. And it's really avoided problems because people really do remember then what they have to do. I suggested to one of the other volunteer activities in church that they had golden rules, and they said, oh, great, good idea, and wrote them, and they give the volunteers the sheet, but they're never reinforced. And so I've had to say to somebody, no, you don't agree to meet up with a guest outside because it leads to potential problems, X, Y, and Z. So I think having that clarity is really important. And underlining Julia's thing about personal connection, I think that makes a real difference, because I have noticed that the only real difficulties we've had have been with some of the outside people from outside the church who we've had no personal connection with. And so I make a real effort in the email communication we have to be friendly and give people a chance to get back to us if they have questions, because otherwise it feels like management, not personal connection. And I think that relationship and personal connection is very important. Thank you. Over to Polly again.
Thanks again, Jo and Julia. So that was the section on building a framework of support, providing guidance on roles and practicalities. I really liked that tip about distilling down the guidance and then repeating it so it's reinforced, and the importance of relationships. So are there any questions from anybody on what you've just heard? Oh yes, Claire, would you like to unmute yourself?
I was interested in your last comment, Jo, about trying to avoid things not feeling like management. And I wondered if you could say anything more about avoiding this sort of hierarchical feeling in an organisation, particularly in a church where you've got your incumbency, and then they're trying to encourage people to be part of the active community, but helping them to feel that they're part of it rather than being managed.
I absolutely agree with you. And in fact, I've had exactly the same question that I've had to throw to people who do things like the welcomers rota and the readings rota, actually trying to think that these are personal things. It's not just a convenience. So I think look at the rotas you do and try and think, how can these be worded, or how can you send out to ask people in a way that doesn't make it just look like a job that's got to be done, but how can we say, this is important because it's a bit like Julia was saying, do people understand the why? Do they realize why this is important? Including that in your background for actually trying to do the recruitment, I think, or trying to get the thing up and running. It's how it's framed, I think, is really important.
And if I can add to that, I think it's also about modeling. So I think the first question is, are you willing to model something that is not very hierarchical? And do you understand why you're doing that? So if it's because you understand that the body of Christ is made up of different members who are all equally important, actually, are you talking about that? And are you talking about what that means? So if, for example, you've got an outreach project where there are what you might sort of say is, well, this is the person in charge and these are the volunteers, and then there are the participants. But sometimes actually somebody who comes as a guest might want to offer something into that space. And that's why I was saying about it's important to understand that you do need to be willing to blur some of those boundaries, but you need to also do a risk assessment on it. So the blurring of the boundaries, it means that you don't stop people contributing, but you do understand that if they've slipped into contribution without some of the guidance that's needed to keep the rest of the setup safe, then you need to be attentive to that. But I think the biggest question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we want it to be an inclusive space? Do we want it not to be hierarchical? And instead of just talking about it, are we actually modeling it? Because it's got to be modeled by whoever is perceived as the most, senior person, actually being open and welcoming and not swaggering around as if they're incredibly elevated. So do we understand it? Do we talk about it? Do we model it? I think.
Great, thank you. I think we'll move on then to the next section. As I said, any questions that occur, please pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end.
Fab, thanks. And again, on that sort of, can't say too much about how giving guidance on the role and clarifying tasks helps you not only set the role up well, but when something goes wrong, go back and say, this is how the role is it has to work, can we just refresh it? So it's much easier if you've got clear clarity to then go back to it if you hit a crisis. Same with managing formalities. Same with mutual expectations, same with building good relationships that will enable you hopefully to have a meaningful and helpful conversation rather than telling people off, although we all do that occasionally, I know I do, and also encouraging development. So all of these things matter and there are sections on each of them. So this is probably what you've come for, and you might have questions. So tackling difficulties. So tackling difficulties is not like in a separate room. It's actually part of good support, because actually, if a difficulty arises, it's probably not just impacting on the person who you might perceive as the source of the difficulty. It'll also be impacting on, even if it's just the atmosphere. So it is really important to see that tackling difficulties is a normal part of good support. And I think also dealing with things before they cause damage helps things, might be a problem, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a crisis. So back what I said, it's almost like normalizing the fact that things go wrong and not panicking about it. And in a sense, Claire's question speaks to that as well, because if you have an atmosphere where people have permission to raise stuff, they're more likely to raise it with you before the proverbial has hit the fan. Whereas if you don't have that sort of open, forgiving, explicitly forgiving sort of atmosphere, then people will hide stuff, and then it's often much harder to retrieve a situation. So, and this is all in section 8 of working with volunteers. So I think tackling difficulties is about accepting these things, and not just accepting them in your head, but being open about that with your volunteers and anybody else, perhaps your PCC, because your PCC might see you doing a project or something that they see as a bit risky, and they'd like it to be so tidy that there are no risks. And sometimes it's partly about communicating that the thing you're doing does have some risks, but how are you dealing with them? So what's the basis of tackling difficulties? Well, people are human. Things will go wrong. They will make mistakes. I will make mistakes. The volunteer will make mistakes. It's just a part of being human. If you keep the purpose of what you do central, then if somebody is doing something which you consider to be wrong in some way, so they're either dealing with something, they're either not following the process, so perhaps they're breaking a health and safety or a safeguarding procedure, or they're breaking, or they're speaking to somebody in a way that's inappropriate or something like that. It is much easier to talk about it when you pull it back to why you're there, what you're trying to do, and frame any conversation with the purpose central, rather than focusing on, you know, you've broken the rule, or your behavior is unacceptable. It's just like, no, what are we trying to do here? Take it back to first principles. What are we trying to do here? Why does it matter how we do it? Why does this thing matter? Oh, right, okay. So you're shifting understanding and hopefully making it less about the person and more about, yes, we're just reminding ourselves of what happens. Clarity helps enormously. Clarity at the beginning, but also if something's going wrong, particularly in church circles, and I've observed a tendency to sort of think it's almost a criminal offence to point out that something's wrong, because we're all so nice, that it would be really rude to mention that something's wrong. But actually, if it needs addressing, there is that thing about admonishing one another. Sometimes that's necessary. So if something's not okay, it has to be okay to say that it's not okay, because if it isn't okay, it will undermine what you're doing. So actually being clear is helpful, but again, it's about the why. Why are you saying that? And also, how are you saying it? It is not about humiliating somebody. It's about tackling it. And in that one, culture is key, again, about the open culture, but also normalizing that stuff will happen and you will address it, but you will address it with the purpose central. And in a sense, coming around full circle, issues will arise back to because people are human. And sometimes the volunteer coordinator, and I've been there and done this, will be the cause of the problem. And sometimes a volunteer might be the cause of the problem. Sometimes the institution might be the cause of the problem. Sometimes if you're in a church, the incumbent might be the problem, or the church warden. The honours are fairly evenly divided, but just let's assume that something's going to go wrong. And the only question is, if we care about the thing we're doing, let's tackle the thing that's going a little bit wrong. Let's tackle it together, and let's tackle it with our culture and our purpose central, because that takes a lot of the heat out of it. In the guidance, so when Jo and I talked about this quite a few years ago now, we thought about, what sort of process might it be? Now, I'm not offering this as etched on tablets of stone, but just as an offering of something that might help. So if something's happening, that the temptation is to panic madly because something going wrong feels like a failure. And if, like me, you have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, you probably think that it was your fault, even if it wasn't. So this framework helps to calm that down a little bit. So what can you do? Well, firstly, you listen, don't you? You listen to what's going on. Like to say, I don't always manage to do this. Listen to what's going on. Respond positively. So don't always manage to do that either, but in an ideal world, respond positively to the people involved. But the key here is, I think, give yourself space then to reflect. So sometimes you think something's going wrong, I'm going to listen, and then I'm going to solve it. Particular problem for me. If you can say to yourself, I'm going to listen, I'm going to respond positively, but I'm going to explicitly take time to reflect on what's been said, what impact and suggestions. And then you might need to consult. Somebody might have raised an issue that actually you need to ask other people about. And then you have permission, if you're in charge of this setup, to make a decision, or you might need somebody else to make the decision. And then you need to communicate. But if you can have a framework, this is not perfection, obviously, but if you can have a framework like this, the thing that it helps with is saying, I'm going to hear what the issue is. I'm going to respond positively by saying that I've heard it and I'm going to follow up. But I'm then going to reflect and consult and make a decision. And my decision might not be the decision that the person who raised the issue initially wanted me to make, but at least I will have listened and reflected on it. So you don't have to have a knee-jerk reaction. And speaking personally, I would say that when I go for the knee-jerk reaction, it's usually when I'm at my worst. So this is ideal world, but if you can at least give yourself permission to do it, it's a good thing to have. And this is in the guidance. Right, next slide. Jo, over to Jo for a brief example.
Yes, that listen and respond positively for me has been key, because I do find or recognise in myself that it's very easy to be defensive. We had a situation recently where we had a very critical volunteer who'd actually worked in shelters and other situations in other churches and felt we were doing it wrong and could do it much better. And the temptation I found was to be defensive because we got the thing planned, we got the thing up and running, but listen, respond positively. I did actually sit down and listen, talk to her, and let her tell me more about what they'd done in the other place, why it worked, how that linked in with the purpose of what we were doing, whether it would help the purpose of what we were doing. It was actually about how we set up the volunteers coming in and the jobs they did. And I did say I talked to the other people who did help me with the coordination. And what we did was we said to her, it sounds quite a good idea. You know, why don't you write out a draft list, a timetable of the jobs that need doing? And she wanted to time them exactly. Well, she did it. She'd done it. She felt listened to. Nobody took a blind bit of notice. They went on doing it in the way they had before. But I think because we listened and responded positively, and found a way of involving her, it actually avoided some of the sense of conflict and criticism. Another quick example was the volunteer who, on more than one occasion, dropped out with less than half an hour's notice, which of course made it quite impossible to find another volunteer at that stage. Again, that was a case of needing to listen. It was on email, so perhaps listening is the wrong word, but at least opening up a conversation that gave her an opportunity to say whether it was the right job, whether there were other things she could do that might fit her timetable better, and again, building a personal relationship. So not just leaving it and saying, oh, she's flaky, we won't ask her again, actually involving her in the conversation and building a a personal relationship. So I think some of these things about listening, not getting defensive, building a relationship, can often themselves help the crises or potential crises. Over to Polly.
Yeah, thank you, Jo, and thank you for bringing us back to the importance of relationships in all of this. Are there any questions? So that was kind of the last section of input. So we can take questions on tackling difficulties or questions on anything else that this session has raised for you. And then Julia and I will just do a few minutes of wrapping up in a minute. So are there any questions? I can't see any hands. It's quite a lot of you, so I'm just going to scroll through the screens. We did have a couple of questions in the chat. So somebody asked about whether we have any tools and resources to enable a skills audit. They mentioned Head, Heart, Hands, which is a tool that we offer. We also have a congregational and a community survey tool, and I will share the links to all of those in the email that I send out after this session. Somebody else asked if Jo could share the 7 golden rules. We can share those. They are developed by Glassdoor, and they are specifically for volunteers in the context of a winter night shelter, but I think they would be helpful to share anyway as an example. And Catherine Oakley shared a link to some free resources from the Church of England to help recruit volunteers to work with children and young people. And again, I'll share that link in the email. Were there any questions?
Polly, I can see there's a question about how do you manage personality clashes?
Go for it.
So I think I don't have a pat answer to that because it depends what the clash is. But I think it's back to that same thing about listening. So is it a personality clash? Is it a power imbalance, or what is actually going on? Because I think sometimes things present. So generally speaking, in a church context, I would hope that if some of the values you have are accepting that people are different and work differently, that you accept that not everybody will have the same approach as you, and you're willing to embrace working with people who may do things differently, but there are reasons for that, and they bring skills and different approaches. And again, back to the body of Christ, you know, they may be a fingernail, not an elbow, but you can work with that. Sometimes I think it is back to the listening, because I think it's unpacking what's going on underneath that. And I think it's also being pragmatic, because if people aren't working brilliantly together, giving them a way to work with somebody else or in a different setting might be the solution. But I think just be conscious of whether you do that in a way that undermines your intrinsic values, that you are willing to work together. I noticed my colleague Caroline is on the call. She's going to laugh now because she thinks I'm going to do this, because she does work in our diocese with peace building. So I don't know whether she's got any wisdom from that she might not want me to ask.
You're right. It does put me on the spot a bit, and I think what you said was absolutely right. But the practice that you use of listening well at the beginning, I mean, it's the foundation of everything, really.
Thank you. And I think being explicit that we're all different is just incredibly important, because I think and I think the church is particularly guilty of this, assuming that we know that we're all different and we're willing to work with that. And I think sometimes it's good to be more explicit that that is our core value, and actually we don't like everybody equally, and we don't find everybody equally easy, but there is something about do we love everybody even if we don't find them easy to like. But you also want to, Jo's going to add something wiser, I'm sure, while I'm wittering.
I don't think wiser, but I think very often a personality clash will come down or be expressed on a particular issue. And one of the things I've found useful is to talk with people or get them to talk to each other about why they think what they think is important is important. And very often it goes back to a bit of history and an experience they've had. And one can affirm that experience. But actually, if people realise that their values have arisen out of different experiences, it then becomes easier sometimes to accept that other people will have had different experiences and have slightly different priorities.
I think that's really helpful as well. I notice also we've got a question saying we have volunteers and also service users that have become volunteers. How is it best to manage differing abilities? There are some sections in the guidance on, and I'm trying to think how it's worded. Polly, can you remember how it's worded, or Jo? But there is something on differing abilities. I don't know that it's worded exactly like that, but there is a section on it. But I think what I would say about that is I think it's important that service users can make the transition into volunteering, because I think that's respectful of people's different abilities and the different things that they bring. I think it's just important not to be naive or careless about it. So it needs some boundaries, and they need to have the right support. And I'll give you a very quick classic example. When I worked in a secular environment, we used to have community payback people, and occasionally the community payback people, when they'd finished their community payback, sometimes they wanted to become volunteers. And we were always absolutely cock-a-hoop when that happened. And we had a few people with varying abilities. We had one person who had particularly high abilities but a very challenging background, and we were so delighted that they'd made this transition. They made a transition from volunteering into paid employment, and it went badly wrong in the end because we had been too naive about having the support structures in place that person needed. And our naive sort of delight at the transition was at the expense of that person having the support that they needed. So I think it's and we've had other people with differing abilities. I had a volunteer once who came to me wanting to volunteer, and it took me a long time to find the right role for him. But if he'd done the wrong role, it would have all gone terribly wrong. Whereas in the right role that matched his abilities and his particular really, really great skills, and didn't expose him to contexts which would have been too unpredictable for him to cope, it worked beautifully. So it's about trying to make sure you are matching. It's back to those circles, the right person in the right role within the organization. So let's hope all of the people on the screen, your organizations and churches, are committed to inclusivity. But however committed to inclusivity you are, it is only kind to somebody to help them have the right role with the right support for their abilities, and to be really attentive to that piece of discernment. I've just seen another one come up. Can you say anything about
Julie, I was just going to add to that as well.
Great.
I think there's also, as well as differing abilities, I think there's also something in that question about the difference between projects that are set up with a volunteering model and projects that are set up with a participatory model. And I think those are two different things. This session has been about projects with a volunteering model. And I think in future, we may well run a webinar where we look at projects that are set up with an intentional participatory model. The Places of Welcome network, which some of you will know, certainly has participation at its core. It doesn't use the language of volunteering, and it's entirely appropriate for that sort of project and program. But today we're talking about projects where they're based on a volunteering model. And so Caroline, I just noticed, had a hand up, and I just wondered if she wanted to chip in on this particular question before we move to another one.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I'm kind of come to as being active as opposed to passive. So the thing that I really think is important to know is that with any disagreement, we often run away from it, but actually those points of conflict are opportunities for transformation. And so not staying fixed, but remaining curious feels really important. The work from Reconcile feels helpful where there is actual thinking about how to work through conflict well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Julia, did you want to pick up this question about...
I'm just reading it. So the question says, can you say anything about situations where people from the church and people from outside are volunteering together in a church-led project and managing difficulties which might arise from this? I think that, Jo, given that that exactly describes your context, you'd be much better at answering this. Do you want me to read it again?
Yes, I can see it in the chat.
Okay, fab.
It's really interesting, this, because in fact, Glassdoor, although they started as a totally church-based project, have tended to move away from that. We do try to very subtly include people in the prayer. We always have a prayer before each session. But somebody else says they feel very embarrassed leading a prayer with people who aren't from the church. I've dealt with that by finding useful quotes and about hospitality or about participation or about service, and using that to lead into a prayer. I don't want to be apologetic about it being church, but I think it does help to say, we are doing this because different people have different motivations. Again, acknowledging it from the beginning, I think is quite helpful. But at the same time, I think it's helpful for the volunteers to be aware that they're helping the church with a church-based project.
Yeah, thanks, Jo.
And can I add a sentence to that, just to say, sometimes we overplay the division between our church and our community, and I think always looking for where are the points of connection, where are the shared values, what is our shared desire for the good of all God's people, whether we would name it like that or not, is helpful in being an inclusive environment, but which is, as a colleague of mine used to say, distinctively Christian but utterly inclusive. And I think looking for the points of connection and not othering people because they're not regular church members is a really good principle on which to build.
Thank you. Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Great. So we've got 2 minutes left. Julia, did you want to say...
I just quickly flagged that this slide I put up again, there's a problem-solving procedure overview. There's a template for a problem-solving procedure, which I would recommend. There's some stuff on tackling difficulties. There's some examples of specific difficulties, and there's a bit on the listen, respond, reflect, consult, decide. So you can pick all this up if you're interested in your own time.
Yeah. Thank you. So all that remains is for me just to thank Julia and Jo for their time today, for their sharing their wisdom and their experience. I've certainly learnt a lot and have a lot to think about after today's session. You will receive an email in the next few days with the slides, a link to the recording, links to all the documents and the templates that we've mentioned, and some of the other links that have been requested. You can go to the resources section of the CUF website today and download our guide to working well with volunteers that Julia has referred to throughout the session. You can also go to the website to explore our recording of previous webinars, including how you can grow a culture of hospitality and generosity in your church, and how you can find and use data about your local community to help with planning for mission. And we'll be publishing details of our autumn webinar series soon. And finally, we would love to share inspiring stories of when volunteering has gone well, especially during Volunteers Week. So if you have any examples, please let us know and we can share them on social media with the permission of all involved, of course.